It's another night. I can't sleep. Some nights come easier than others. But like many, I think about things. Sometimes these memories just help pass the time, and sometimes they haunt me. Some nights I can go to sleep without thinking about it. Other nights, like tonight, I have no choice but to think about it. So let me tell you a story. A story that keeps me up at night. A story that's more modern, more contemporary. One that haunts my dreams. A story about a confession booth. Before I get started, these are unedited. Where to start? The year's 2020. And this is a story about a man, just like any other. He wakes up in the morning and he does what anyone else does. He picks up his phone and he listens to the news. He listens to NPR to hear about all the stories about America, anything he might need to know. Then he transitions over and begins to, listen to the BBC World News Podcast. To listen about the world. He'd be a fool to only listen to American egocentric news. And he does this like clockwork. And every day he would listen to the NPR, to the BBC, and then he would get up and go on with his day. At this time, he remembers hearing about some news, something concerning in China, something in Wuhan. I'm sure many of you know where this story is going. He's concerned, but he listens to the news and he gets up and he continues on with his day. A story far, far away. A story that doesn't concern his day-to-day life. But every day, he starts his day again. And he listens to Up First on NPR. Then he listens to the BBC. And every day he hears some news about it, just a little more. He remembers at the time, on just one of those days again. He remembers seeing hashtag World War III trending on Twitter. He's concerned. He hasn't lived through World War I or World War II, but he's listened and read enough books and done enough research. He likes history, and he knows the cost of war. He's concerned. Conflict in the Middle East. But that's neither here nor there. He begins to become more increasingly concerned when he starts hearing it on Up First, on the NPR first. He woke up that morning, and he began and listened to NPR like he normally does, and they began talking about the strain, Russian borders closing down, genome sequences beginning, and he knows it's serious. It's one thing to hear it on the BBC World News. It's on the World News, of course, but when it enters an American-centric news source, things begin to change. Granted, he's also heard rumors circling around communities. Immigrant families were already starting to buckle down. They had already begun buying provisions en masse, buying masks, buying gloves. They know better. They understand when worse comes to shove. I think that's the phrase. Immigrants, those in lower socioeconomic conditions, the underprivileged, are left behind. They begin making provisions. They begin preparing. And they do this with no uncertainty that this will come to America. They know. They see as those Americans as themselves, but those with privilege walk around with no concern for others or themselves. Just a rumor in a far, far away country. But they know better. They begin telling children. They begin telling their children. They begin warning others in their communities. And they take this to heart. But that's, I suppose, just something that happens. Now this man, he begins to see it in his community. He wakes up. He listens to the NPR, he listens to the BBC, and well, he does something that day. He goes to work, and he begins seeing it creeping into his small little neighborhood. Now what does he see? He works with patients, of course, the frontline healthcare worker. And he begins seeing the postings and small little pamphlets and handouts on the walls of where he works. Data from the CDC, data from China, what to watch out for, the possibility of being airborne, the hospital's emergency program, the emergency group, just in case it comes and hits their community. How do you deal with death? It never does get easier. At this point, I think everyone knows what this story is about. It's a story on a perspective that keeps me up at night. Something that won't let me sleep. How do you deal with death? There's different stories on how you deal with it by yourself, how you interact with others. But it's always particularly hard when talking to those that are impacted the most. The family members, the friends. It never gets easier. He remembers every single name, every single patient that he's lost. Not for the lack of trying. What do you do? He's talked to colleagues. He's gotten advice. But it never gets easier. Each life is different and unique. What do you do? Do you stare at the ground? Or do you look at them? Sorrow works in many, many weird ways. Anger, sadness, despair. Do you look at their eyes? Look at all the family members as they look back towards you. Their faces, always different, but always the same. Their eyes filled with anger, maybe sadness, grief. Looks that you can never forget. Things that drown your soul in sorrow. But you begin your day again, like he does. You open your phone, you listen to the NPR and the BBC, and you start your day again. He remembers when the first patient of his showed up. He's heard about it before. His colleagues said the very first patient showed up in the ER today. Everyone was on high alert. They immediately placed him in the isolation zone. People donned on their PPE. And they began to go to work. Today was his first day with his first patient. He remembers it. Now, I won't go into any details. I think it would bore you. The conditions were similar to anyone else. Middle-aged. And due to HIPAA, I won't be revealing any extra information, just very broad ones. Middle-aged, COVID, all the general symptoms. They had no diagnostic set at this point. This person had not been in interaction with anyone from Wuhan, but nonetheless, we believed him to have it. Severe respiratory distress. He was the first one to go. He was stabilized. But by the time I came in next morning, he was gone. Dead in the ICU. Not his first casualty, but a name he would add to his list. Days and weeks go by, and it never got easier. We began limiting patients. The world got a little more bright-eyed to the idea that this could be a threat. But he would shake in anger sometimes, realizing the lies that the decisions of his executive branch, his president, was making. His complete disregard for the patients he saw. But that's also besides the point of this story. This story takes place weeks, months into this pandemic. He had been looking at some patients in the isolation ward, those with the virus. Let me describe to you, let me try to paint you a picture. PPE at this point is hard to come by, to the point where any and all forms of PPE are under lock and key due to theft in hospitals, from patients walking into storage rooms, from employees potentially taking them. Regardless, all PPE, especially N95s, are under lock and key, only taken with authorization. That's how serious it is. But he's had a patient, someone he's looked after for days now. They've stabilized. But recently he's come to the worst. His family can't come to see him. So what do? You put on the PPE and you take out the phone. We call it the phone because it's the one we use to do that FaceTime, that video chat. The one that lets the family know. You walk in there completely donned in PPE, knowing that you have patients in another room, patients that need your time, but you know you have to do this yourself. So you walk in there, and they nod at you. They recognize you. And you call them. A fly on the wall, with all the responsibility of the world. You hold it for them, and you hear stories. You hear goodbyes. Some things that you're not meant to hear. But you listen, because you have to. Because you have a responsibility. So you hold it. They talk. Some of them are good enough. Some of them have enough oxygen to maintain very brief conversations, and then they go back into breathing a little more. Sometimes they just type, or they have you help them. But this conversation he remembers. The family on the other side of the phone, a distance away, unable to see him. And the man, knowing that this would be his last time, it never gets any easier. So when they're done, he looked at me and he shook my hand. I shook his and I left. A handshake a lifetime away. Not to be cold-hearted, but I catalog it and I continue with my day, patient after patient, room after room, donning on my PPE, changing the PPE. And that day, something came over me. I sat in my car, and I thought, never gets easier. The Grim Reaper wears black, and angels wear white. And I wear white, but I'm nothing more than a glorified Grim Reaper. That day I sat in my car, and I cried. I remembered the first patient. I remembered the first patient this virus took, and I began to think of every other patient I've had. I'm tired, exhausted. But that doesn't matter. You get back to work. And it doesn't help that this keeps you up at night. He's never been a religious man. But that night, he drove to his church. Or a church. He was driving back and he noticed that very, very familiar cross. And he drove to that church's parking lot and he sat there. He wiped away the tears, mentally, physically, emotionally exhausted. And he walked up to the church. He began stepping out of his car. He locked the car. And he walked across that parking lot. And he pauses on the steps of that church. And he stops. He waits. And he thinks, what am I doing here? What am I doing? But he decides to risk it. He goes to the front doors and it opens. The man dressed in black asks him, "Can I help you?" And he says, "I'm not sure." And the man in black says, "Well, seems like you have a story to tell." And he just nods. He goes in, and the man in black leaves and walks to the back of the room, out of sight. And the man walking in, his eyes look across the church, those benches, and he notices the box in the corner. the booth. And he walks over and he sits down. And he says, well, he thinks there's no one on the other side. There's no response. And he says, I have sinned. He begins to describe his journey. And then he says, I took the life of a child today. They were fine 5 days ago. They came in with trouble breathing. We quarantined them. We stabilized them. And day after day, I came in to work. They looked better. They were getting better. But today I came in, and I just remembered a conversation. Something dragged on my stomach as I walked into work today. I remembered a conversation I had with a little girl. She asked me, when I'm done, will I be strong enough to play tag again? Will you play with me? And I, of course, nodded and said, of course I will. You know what? After this is all over, if you come to me, I'll take some time and play some tag with you. The sweetest smile. The pinky promise. Initially, she was scared of the man, dressed in blue, mask on his face. But now she came to understand me. And today, I walked into her room. Her O2 was dropping. We were about to take her up to the ICU. Her vitals didn't look good. She couldn't talk. Not with that tube coming out of her mouth. But she looked at me. And she spelled out the word tag. I smiled. My heart ripped apart. A few hours later, I went and took that phone for the man early in the story. I said to him, and that's how the story ends. I'm nothing but a glorified Grim Reaper. And the man begins to walk out of the booth. And to his surprise, he hears, You have not sinned, my son. He was shocked. He was surprised. He was afraid. He was angry. He was sad. He was happy. And he was also ashamed, all at the same time. He thought no one was there. But I guess at some point, someone sat down. And at that point, the tears wouldn't stop. His face didn't scrunch up. He didn't make any sounds. It was almost like a movie. His right eye began to drop. Tears began to stream down his face. It was just his right eye at the moment. He felt weird. He was too tired to think about what was happening. And then, just as suddenly, tears began streaming out on both his cheeks. And he leaned against the wall and sobbed into his hands. Tears dripping down that white coat. Anything and everything that happened afterwards this moment are not mine to tell. This story, this vulnerable moment, it haunts me at night. Every single face,